So the next big event on our timeline is the Industrial Revolution. And to really get a hold of what happened there, we have to go back in the past quite a bit. Prior to the breakup of the Roman Empire, slavery was how the work of the world got done universally through all of human history and every human culture. So for all of recorded history, which begins about 5,000 years ago, 5 to 10,000 years ago, where there's this time frame in which people begin to form what we think of as modern civilizations. But wherever we find civilization arising on the planet, there is slavery. And that continues all through antiquity up until the fall of Rome. And thereafter for a very long time. But with the advent of Christianity in the world, slavery gradually begins to decline as an institution. Now, it continues in the form of the African slave trade right up until the time period that we're talking about, with the Industrial Revolution happening around the same time, really hitting its stride around the same time as the American Civil War. But the African slave trade is a little different in terms of what it was. And we'll revisit that in a minute. But the thing I want you to understand here is that slavery was a given. Slavery was a facet of human civilization, so much so that nobody questioned it. And if you had gone to an ancient person, if you go in a time machine back into times when slavery was universal, and told people that slavery was bad and that we shouldn't do it, they would think you were insane. How will things get done? They could not imagine a world in which the manual labor could be done any other way besides through slavery. And when Christianity first begins, slavery is such a feature of civilization that it's not questioned even by the earliest Christians. One of the letters of Paul in the New Testament is basically telling an escaped slave to return to his master. The master is also someone whom Paul has converted to Christianity, and he tells the master to treat the slave well and the slave to return to his master. But at no point does Paul think that slavery as an institution is something that's unchristian. But Christianity grows and changes. And what happens over time is that the implications of the gospel gradually kind of come to fruition in what becomes Christian culture. So with the fall of Rome, everything falls apart. A new civilization founded on Christianity arises in Europe. And gradually and unevenly, but inexorably, slavery stops happening. When you have a situation where God becomes a person, becomes the lowest kind of person, when your God has died the death of a slave, right? It's kind of hard to have slaves anymore. This idea that everyone is equal before God and that everyone owes God their allegiance, and God sees every person with equal dignity. That is a new idea in the world. And Christianity adopts this way of looking at things, and it gradually makes slavery simply morally untenable. And there was never a slave uprising. There was never a time in the Christian world where there was a revolution to overturn slavery as a thing. It just gradually died out. And the way it died out is interesting. A slave has no rights, zero, right? They are property. But what happens is, in the feudal order of things, what you have is kind of a continuation of the Roman order. The Roman order was wealthy families, patrons, and then the plebeians being the people surrounding this wealthy person. So you had a wealthy person with a big house, and then kind of a village surrounding that. And the wealthy person was responsible for this local community. And But that community had all kinds of people in it, but a great many of them were slaves who had no rights and no claim on the patron at all. In the feudal order, you used to have the same sort of situation. You have a noble, or you have someone with power and authority who has a castle, right? This is your kind of fairy tale sort of feudal arrangement, the castle on the hill with the village around it. But it was a way of organizing society. And the lord of the castle, the person who had the money and the might and the big building that was safe, and armor, right, and soldiers, they were responsible, like the Roman patrons were, for the village and the people that surround this strong point. But there are no slaves. In the feudal order, the slaves become serfs, and the serfs are an interesting kind of social structure. It's not slavery, and it's not peasantry. The serf was bound to the land. The serf couldn't leave. Okay, the serf was stuck there to some degree. They're bound to the land, but the difference between a serf and a slave is a serf has rights. They are bound to the land. They can't leave, but they cannot be pushed away. They can't be deprived of the land either. And the noble person, or the strong person, the person in power in that area, owes to the serfs protection and patronage. And so it becomes this kind of symbiotic relationship where everybody owes something to somebody, and as long as everybody keeps doing what they should be doing, everything works out fine. And when the Vikings show up, for instance, they can all run to the castle, and this worked. And then gradually, what happens is the serfs become peasants, and the peasants own the land, right? It's their land, and so you gradually have this situation where slavery just dies out as a thing. And the thing that replaces it is peasantry, which is your folks in the villages doing their cottage industries, and the guild system. And the guild system is a fascinating thing. So the guild system was so universal and so powerful and such a big part of Western civilization for so long that many of our last names that we carry with us to this day are simply the names of guilds. And people would identify themselves in that way. This idea of a surname that's a family name, right, that we have now, first and last name, is a fairly new idea in the world. Everyone in the ancient world would have identified themselves by the city of their birth more than anything else. And you see names like that. St. Francis of Assisi, right? Leonardo da Vinci, that means Leonardo from Vinci is his hometown. So I would be Tim of Apache, right? That would be my name. But when the guild system really became a thing, people began to take their last name not of the city of their birth, but of the guild to which they belonged. And so that's why we have last names like Smith and Mason and Wagoner and Cartwright. These are all guilds. These are all, a carpenter, right? These are trades. And the way the guilds worked was a way of organizing cottage industry, a way of organizing people making things with their hands and doing the kind of labor that slaves would have done before. But with a billion times more dignity and quality and pride, right, than simply having slaves knock things together. And the guild system had an interesting way of perpetuating itself. So if you wanted to be part of one of these trades, if you wanted to be a carpenter or a mason, a stonemason, for instance, and there were many others, weavers, right, all kinds of different guilds you could belong to, you could simply hire on as an apprentice. And there were basically three levels of hierarchy in a guild. You had apprentices, you had journeymen, and you had masters. And we still use a lot of this terminology today. When you get a master's degree, for instance, that harkens back to the old guild system. The apprentice, their job was simply to learn the trade and to aid the journeyman in making stuff. And so an apprentice would not get paid much at all, but they would get room and board for sure. They would be able to keep body and soul together, right? They would take care of you, and if you did a good job as an apprentice, and you aided the journeyman in making what they make, and learned the trade, you could then move up a level and become a journeyman yourself, and then you would have apprentices working under you, and if you attained a master's level, right? If you became so good at this that you became a master, which there were very few of, then you moved up another level further. And the journeyman aided you in making what are masterpieces. That's where we get that word, a masterpiece. And so if someone wanted a table, they could go to the Carpenters Guild and they say, give me a table. Well, how much do you want to pay for a table? You can have one that's knocked together by the apprentices, right, for pretty cheap. Or you can have a journeyman table for more. But if you want a masterpiece, it's going to cost you. But this meant that everyone who wanted to could learn a trade. Imagine the social security. I mean, we think about the Middle Ages as a pretty terrible time, right? And the plague made it worse. There's all kinds of awfulness in the Middle Ages. But this wasn't so awful. They didn't get everything wrong, right? They figured out how to get the work of the world done without slaves, and how to have pretty much everybody in their culture be able to at least eat and have something, a place to stay. You could pick a trade and become an apprentice, and if you never rose up past the level of apprentice, you still would not starve. But there were also, you could very well move up. And so you ended up with a situation where there was a way to do this, to get stuff done without slavery, and to make sure that everybody had the security that they needed. And then if you were completely disabled in some way, you had the charity of the church. And the church in the Middle Ages, before the Protestant Reformation, was incredibly wealthy, and they spent vast amounts of money on charity. So every single town would have had an abbey, would have had some sort of land that belonged to the church, and there would be people there whose jobs were to take care of the poor. And the other thing that the Middle Ages had for people who were not doing well in the social order was the commons. And the commons was land set aside by the church. In every little area the common land didn't belong to anybody. Anyone could use it. And it had to have certain features. It had to have fresh running water, it had to have wildlife and game, and it had to have arable soil so you could grow things. So if you were absolutely at your end of what you could do, if some disaster had happened in your life, and you were simply thrown back on the charity of the church, they would say, hey, there's the commons right there. Go build you a little hut, grow some vegetables, right? Hunt, fish. You'll be all right. This is the way that people, the medieval world took care of people. And when the Protestant Reformation happened, all of that got blown to pieces. The nobility took all the church's land and eventually took all of the common land. And they destroyed the power of the guilds, because the guilds were also supported by the church. And the guilds were an incredibly powerful organization. We think of labor unions now as being powerful organizations in the world of work and labor. They've got nothing on the power that a guild would have. If all the stonemasons decided they weren't building anything out of stone for a while, that was it. Nothing's getting built. And so in the wake of the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, the nobility who had seized all of this power and all this wealth and all of this property from the church had a very strong interest in destroying the power of the guilds, and they did so. And then the Industrial Revolution comes along, right? All of a sudden, cottage industries just cease to exist. So you can't just make a table now as a carpenter and sell a table on the market. Because now there's factories making tables that are crappy tables, but they're making them cheap. And so the cottage industry just dies. And all these people that would have been in guilds before the Protestant Reformation, that would have been making a living just fine, were suddenly thrown into dire poverty. There simply was not a way for them to be okay. There was nothing they could do. except go to the cities where the factories were and work for the factory owners. And because these were new situations, nothing like this had happened in human history, all kinds of crimes were committed that weren't crimes because they were new crimes. There were no laws against them. And so the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, with the child labor, with the hours, with the pay, these are all things that just happen, right? And it's horrible that they did. And the consequences of these things happening were just horrific for the world in ways that are still a problem for us. But the factory owners, by and large, just decided to abuse everyone who worked for them. They paid them starvation wages, just enough to keep them alive, long enough to pull the lever on whatever machine they're standing at. England passed a law in the late 1800s reforming the factory work system a bit. And so these laws tell you how bad it was, right? This was better. So I'm gonna have to remember this off the top of my head, but this is close to what it was. For instance, one of the reforms was that you couldn't work children under the age of 10 for more than 14 hours. Which means that children under the age of 10 were being worked more than 14 hours before this law got passed. That you had to have at least 2 hours of education a week for children, which meant before they were getting no education at all. The brutality is hard to imagine. And when this takes place, it's just a disaster for so many people. And out of this disaster comes a lot of ugliness that, like as I said, still plagues us now. Communism arises as an idea because of this problem. Marx and Engels are in London, and they're looking at the conditions of the working class in London when they write the Communist Manifesto. And I've been around communism, guys. I spent some time behind the Iron Curtain back in my checkered past. And Marxism is a nightmare. It is an awful, awful way to live. But it was better than what the Industrial Revolution had to offer. And had the Industrial Revolution not been so awful, Marxism would have had no argument, right? When Marx said, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." If these workers of the world were doing okay, they wouldn't have. They'd look, "Well, what do you mean? We're fine, thank you." No, they were starving to death. Their children were being worked to death. They were being buried alive beneath this machinery of the Industrial Revolution, and when that's happening to you, you will clutch at any answer to that problem. You will find a way. And so what I'm trying to, broad brushstrokes here, is that the Protestant Reformation broke the social system of the Middle Ages that had worked for a while. And that was, at that point, the only solution to the problem of getting the world's work done with no slaves. The Industrial Revolution comes along, and because this social order that gets broken doesn't get replaced by anything that will work becomes a nightmare. And and to this day we wrestle with this problem, right? How are people going to be okay? How are we going to live dignified lives, have enough to feed our families, and have some luxuries left over, right? To live a life that is, the people say money can't buy you happiness, and people who've lived in desperate poverty are like, yes, it can. I'm not happy if I don't have food and a roof over my head and a meaningful job and a few luxuries for my family and for myself. And so, this is a question we have to answer again and again, is how are we going to get this done? And there were some desperate attempts at doing something about this that were horrific. Marxism is one of them, fascism is another. But this is kind of where we're at in history. Now, the African slave trade, I promised I'd return to that, is different in this respect. The African slave trade is a different kind of slavery from the slavery of the ancient world. The slavery of the ancient world was about conquest more than anything else. So if the Romans stomped on your culture, which they did to everybody they could possibly get in touch with, right? The Roman Empire was nothing more than robbery on a large scale. They simply used their military might to take over areas and convert them to the Roman Empire, and in doing so, they got a lot of stuff and a lot of slaves. And that's how they kept a steady flow of new slaves arriving into the Roman Empire. But the Greek slave of the Roman patron wasn't looked on as racially inferior in any way. They're just culturally inferior, right? They had the misfortune of getting sideways with the Roman Empire. But it didn't mean that they were not a human being or a lesser human being. They were simply categorized in the category of a slave. And the Romans would have expected, had the tables been turned, right? If the Gauls had won the war against Caesar, the people who were Romans would expect to be slaves of the Gauls, right? That's how it was done. But the African slave trade is based on this idea that the black people who were being enslaved were animals, were inferior, were destined for slavery because they were not quite fully human, which is a different sort of idea. And that went on a lot longer than it ought to have for that reason. So long after Europe and America had completely jettisoned the ancient idea of slavery because it's not Christian, right, to enslave people through conquest, they continued the African slave trade because of the racism that undergirded it. And then we did have a violent war to end that. Right? That didn't end as a result of Christianity sort of percolating this idea of equality for everybody through the culture. It actually had to come to the point of violence. And so this is where we're at. I've put a poem for you guys to read called London by William Blake, and it is a exploration of London during the Industrial Revolution. And I want you guys to look at the poem, and I'm going to ask you a discussion question about it. But I want to go over it just quickly. Well, we can't do this quickly, we need to do it. Let's look at the thing, because there's some language that you're probably not familiar with. I'll read it quickly, and this will be up in your supplemental material for you to go over again. But in this poem, William Blake is taking us, and he's one of the Romantics, by the way. He's not quite a member of that crew that was, the core of the Romantic movement with Shelley and Byron and Coleridge and those guys. But he's definitely of that time period, and was in his own way just too weird for the Romantics. Blake is an odd dude, and in many ways he's visionary. And when I read this to you guys, I want you to understand some of the cultural background. We just talked about the Industrial Revolution, right? But one thing to know about British society at this time, English society, is that they thought of themselves as very good people. They would have considered themselves high Christians, right? Church of England, Anglican. We're morally upright people who are spreading civilization throughout the world. Their opinion of themselves and their actions are direly opposed to one another. And William Blake points this out in this poem. But what I want you to realize as we talk about this, I discuss this with you, is that the average person in London society would not see the same things that Blake does as he takes us around London. For them, this was just the way things were. They would not have been shocked by these things that Blake talks about in this poem. And one of the things that William Blake is trying to do is to shock them. He's trying to wake them up and say, wait a minute, look at this. Look at what's happening here. So let's take a look. I'll read it and then we'll go at it. We'll go a stanza at a time and I'll explain some of the language. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. That's pretty grim stuff, and it gets grimmer when you dig into it. So let's do. He begins this with, I wander through each chartered street. And the word chartered there is an old usage of the word. But it's basically the way we use the word chart when we say, I'm going to chart a course. The chartered streets of London. London was a city that had grown in population enormously in a very short period of time because of the Industrial Revolution, because of all these people moving from the countryside into the city for these factory jobs, which are the only jobs available. So London exploded in population, but not in size. And it's a medieval city, which means it grew up organically. There's no city planning. The streets are all twisty and windy, and when you can't grow outward, you grow upwards. And so you ended up with these 3- and 4-story buildings bordering these narrow, windy streets. And when you were walking down a street in London, it was like being in a slot. You were just, if you were on one end of the street, you're going to the other end. There's buildings on all sides, rising up. And this was true of the river as well, the Thames that runs through London. And so he says, I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. So the Thames had been grown up on both banks by buildings, and was, the whole city was crowded around the river. And any contemporary of William Blake reading this poem, when he mentions the Thames, would have not thought of a wonderful, happy river running through a city. This is the Industrial Revolution. There are no rules about pollution. And London has no sewage system to speak of at this time. It had open sewers, which meant there were channels on the sides of the streets. And when you have a river running through the middle of the city, everything slopes towards the river. And so people basically threw their garbage and refuse and all kinds of other awfulness out the windows into the gutters and waited for the rain to come and wash it down to the river. Not to mention all of the industrial waste that is also flowing into the river. So the Thames River was a cesspool. It was awful. It's in the whole city stank like you would not believe. And because of the predations of the Industrial Revolution, while there were nice areas of London, there were enormous swaths of London that were just nothing but dire, dire poverty. Crime, starvation, disease, privation, rats, dead horses in the street. It's ugly. And so these streets that London is telling us about are like that. And he says, I mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. I've been in places like that when I traveled behind the Iron Curtain. Romania under Ceausescu is one of the worst places in the world. I've been in major cities where there were hundreds and hundreds of people walking everywhere all the time and not a single smile. Everyone is suffering and no sounds. That was one of the weirdest experiences of my life, was walking through the city center of Timisoara, and there's all these people and they're all moving somewhere, but all you hear are footsteps. No one's talking, no one's laughing. Places like that exist in the world, and London was one of them when Blake is writing this poem. He goes on to say, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. A manacle is basically the 19th century version of handcuffs. They were the handcuffs, these manacles, these chains that they would put on you if they arrested you. And so a mind-forged manacle is the chains that our minds put upon us. And every culture has these. Things that are imprisoning to us that come solely through our brains, right? Things that oppress us, that are our creations of our own minds, and we are largely not aware of them. I can give you an example quickly. What would Blake think of as a mind-forged manacle of our own time? attitudes towards our bodies are incredibly awful and unhealthy for us. We never, ever look in the mirror and like what we see. We are always unhappy about our physical appearance. And we have been made this way because advertisers sell us things as a result of making us feel this way, among other reasons. But it's insane. No culture has ever been like this. If you took a person from the medieval world who was kind of plump and put him in front of a mirror and said, hey, look, they'd say, wow, isn't that awesome? Think about how much food I've had this year, right? That I could be fat. Well, this is great. We are nuts when it comes to this. And it's not good for us. It hurts us. It's painful. And Blake would identify that probably as a mind forged manacle. And he moves on and says, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. One of the things that the Industrial Revolution brought to all these medieval cities was coal dust. So these factories ran on coal. And, well, mostly on steam, but steam's got to be heated somehow. And so firing coal was how you did this. And you ended up with this, and coal burns dirty. I mean, it is a black cloud of smoke that comes out when you burn coal. And coal dust sticks to everything. And if you know anything about the Middle Ages were all about color and pageantry. These ancient medieval cities were brightly colored places. The medievals loved their colors and their heraldry. And the Industrial Revolution turned all of these beautiful, colorful, ancient medieval cities dark. It turned them all gray as the coal dust covered everything. And so these churches and cathedrals that were once very beautiful on the outside, gradually in the Industrial Revolution all became a uniform gray color. So he says, the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. What's making the churches turn black is the coal dust. But who are these chimney sweepers? This is going to ruin Mary Poppins for you. The chimney sweepers were the children of the very, very poor. Children were sold to the chimney sweepers by their parents because that was better than watching them starve. And the chimney sweepers, the people who ran the companies that did the chimney sweeping, needed children because children fit in chimneys easier. And this coal dust, because it does stick to everything, would gradually fill up the chimneys and choke the chimneys so they wouldn't work anymore. The answer to this problem in the Industrial Revolution in London was to tie a rope around a small child and lower that child into the chimney to clean it out. The average life expectancy of a chimney sweeper was 4 years. If they didn't die in an accident, if they didn't fall or get trapped in a chimney, the coal dust would fill their lungs and they would die of black lung within a few years, no matter what. So the chimney sweepers, to be a chimney sweeper was a death sentence to children. And when Blake is taking on this tour of London, right? He says, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. This is something you can hear as you walk down the street. You can hear the children crying in the chimneys. And when I said that the average Londoner would have considered themselves to be a good, upstanding Christian, I'm not lying, right? That's what they thought of themselves. And this is a way of Blake saying, how dare you, right? What are you doing? How can you say this? What is Jesus' attitude towards children, right? Christianity is one of the biggest or most earth-shaking changes in the world due to Christianity was the elevation of children in terms of their dignity. Not just to say that children are equal in dignity to adults, but have more dignity, deserve more protection, deserve more consideration. That was an alien thought to the ancient world. Now, there's a moment in the New Testament where these children are crowding around Jesus and he's picking them up and he's touching them and he's blessing them, and the disciples are outraged. And they say, get these kids out of here. And Jesus says, suffer the little children to come to me, because to such as these belong the kingdom of heaven. And when he says that, in that moment, everyone would have been shocked. This is a new idea when he says this. This is a new thing. He begins this idea at that moment in time. Children were considered nothing more than property, if that. In the Roman world, if you had a child you didn't want, you could take it out in the wilderness and leave it to die and still be a good, upstanding Roman citizen. Christianity changes all of that. And yet here we have London in a superficially Christian culture and society where children are being worked to death in the service of these industries. And everyone knows this is not hidden. This is happening in front of everybody. And Blake is saying, it's not the coal dust that's turning the churches dark. It's that they're permitting this to happen. Let's look at the last stanza quickly. He says, but most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Something to know here that everyone who read this poem in that time would have known. This is before penicillin, when syphilis was this devastating disease, incurable and fatal. Children born to mothers who have syphilis were born with their eyes damaged. So babies born with, and if a woman who had a child was pregnant while they had syphilis would transmit the syphilis to the child. So a child being born with their eyes damaged and blind and was a sign that the mother had syphilis. And this marriage hearse at the end, right? And we still do this. We still have this tradition where after the marriage, the couple gets into the car that's been decorated up and drives off. Well, in the 19th century in London, it would have been a carriage. The marriage carriage that you would ride away. And if you've ever seen a Jane Austen movie, that's how they all end. Right? The happy couple driving away in their carriage from the marriage. But Blake calls it a hearse. The hearse is a carriage for carrying dead bodies. And so, now, these aren't the marriages of the poor he's talking about here. Poor people don't have carriages. They don't do this, right? It's rich people, it's middle-class people that have carriages to ride away from their marriages, from their weddings in. So these are, these babies being born with syphilis are being born to middle-class and upper-class mothers. So how are all these upper-class mothers in London getting syphilis? Which brings us to the beginning of this stanza. Most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Whenever you have dire poverty, you're going to have prostitution. It's just going to happen. People will not starve if they can keep from it. And in a situation where women can only sell their bodies, they will. And when we're talking about, when he says youthful, we're talking about very youthful. This links to the chimney sweepers. We're talking about children here. And so these good, upstanding, Christian, British, upper middle class men are frequenting the poor areas of London where the young prostitutes are, and they're bringing syphilis back to their marriages. It's grim stuff, right? But this is a grim time. And it's the social circumstances of this time, the socioeconomic circumstances of this time that create this nightmare. And Blake is going, look at this, open your eyes. So I'm going to ask you a discussion question that extrapolates on this. So be on the lookout for that. And I will have that up in just a bit. So I'm going to try to get, like I said in my last course message back on the Monday, Thursday train instead of a Tuesday, Friday train when it comes to this stuff, but we shall see. So that's that.